John Caulfield is a career American diplomat who has been posted to some countries around the world that have either had the highest American expat populations or the highest numbers of visas being granted, and he served in the consul general capacity in many of those countries, including in, of course, London, England, but also having served in Ciudad Juarez, which is the largest visa-granting consulate for the U.S. in the world. The second highest visa-granting number, which is in Manila, Philippines. He also has served in various other countries in both Europe and Latin America. He served as interim ambassador in Caracas. He has also served as the U.S. State Department's liaison with the U.S. Congress and has received a Meritorious Service Award from both the U.S. President and the U.S. Department of State. My colleague, Laura Macdonald, from the department, is a professor in the Department of Political Science. She is one of the most published members of the department, published widely and in high-quality publications with regard to books and articles in the areas of non-NGOs and development, global civil society, social policies and citizenship in Latin America, Canadian development assistance, Canadian Latin American relations, and the political impact of NAFTA. Most recently, she has published on transnational activism in North America, on labor rights, migration, and human rights, and policies to reduce crime and violence in Mexico City. So welcome to the panel on Crises at the U.S. Border, Is History Any Guide? Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. And as I was listening to all the presentations today, which were really interesting, and in the process, in my mind, I'm sort of revising what I'm going to say, not to be repetitive, and more important, to be relevant to what we're talking about today. So I'm going to skim through some of these slides, which was originally put together as a talk for Americans in terms of our immigration debate. And immigration is an issue where the people have a very high level of opinion and a low level of knowledge. And so the purpose of my talk was to try to improve people's knowledge about what the system is today so that they're in a better position to make decisions or think about how it should be in the future. And so let me see if this works here. Yes. So anyway, today in the United States, we have a population about 324 million, and about 13% of the U.S. population is born abroad. Now, that is relatively higher than it has been for the last 50 years, but generally consistent with where it has been over the last century. Any idea what is it in Canada, percentage of foreign-born population? It's about 21%. So it's about 50% higher than the U.S. Interesting, at least from my perception in the U.S., there's not a big debate about immigration in Canada. So it's curious how it is occurring in the U.S. right now. This shows, again, the foreign-born population. Mostly, this was in 1890, it was mostly from Europe. Today, it is primarily from Latin America and Asia, these new immigrants coming in. And of those immigrants coming to the United States, the overwhelming number are immediate relatives of U.S. citizens, the spouses, parents, and children of U.S. citizens, and then extended relatives, the married sons and daughters over 21, and even brothers and sisters. So again, we're looking at immediate relatives on the far right side. We have lots of other categories, other relatives, but employment-based are about 140,000, 138,000. And then we have refugees, 120,000. And these are for 2017. Half of those refugees are Cubans. So 60,000 for the rest of the world, half are Cubans. They're not processed like normal refugees. They're people who, up until 2017, if a Cuban arrived in the United States, he could stay as a permanent resident. It was the only country in the world that had that privilege. Again, showing the of the immediate relatives, most are spouses. Other relatives, a relatively small number, 238,000. About half of those are the spouses and children of permanent residents, people who already have resident status in the United States. Of the employment base, there are roughly 140,000 a year. Virtually all of these immigrants are high-skilled. There's almost no opportunity for low-skilled legal immigrants to come to the United States now. And a number of those are, very highly skilled, PhDs or people who have international reputations for scholars or artists, and others for, just normal degree workers. There's a small number of investors who will invest up to $1 million in the United States, and there are also a very small number of highly skilled technicians who may not have college degrees but have some expertise. Now, there are also refugees, and the Refugee Act of 1980 lays out criteria for refugees. People who face discrimination or prejudice on the basis of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or public opinion. Now, if you are overseas and applying to enter the United States on one of these criteria, you're considered under our law a refugee. But if you're already in the U.S., say you were a student, things changed, you didn't want to go back for political reasons, you're considered an asylee. The criteria is identical, but the terminology is different depending on whether you're already in the U.S. or whether you're overseas. People showing up on the border are applying for asylum rather than refugee status, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Where are the immigrants coming from? I mentioned Asia and Latin America. Well, Mexico, of course, beyond our border, has the highest number. Second is China. Cuba, India, Dominican Republic. Dominican Republic is a relatively small country, a small population, high number of immigrants. The Philippines, Vietnam, El Salvador, 25,000. Haiti and Jamaica. Those are the top countries. That's about half of the immigrants come from just those countries. And this is just showing, curious, we're looking at the surge of Central American immigrants, and these countries have relatively small populations. El Salvador, 6 million people. 25% of the people who have been born in El Salvador who are alive today are living in the United States. So a huge impact on these countries. And so let me just skip through this, and I want to sort of put some more context in this refugee crisis that we're hearing about. We're hearing about the conditions in Central America. We're hearing about this dramatic increase in the impact on the United States. But what are the facts, and is this really a crisis? The Trump administration announced that they would have zero tolerance to migrants. And what that meant is we would put them all in jail. Of course, we saw what happened there. First of all, we didn't have the capacity to put all these people in jail, and the conditions of some of the detention, especially for the children, were just horrific. And through a combination of public outrage and through court decisions, we more or less abandoned that for now. But we also talked about building the wall, and this became a huge thing in the United States. Any static barrier can be overcome unless you have people on the other side to pick up those who get across it. You need the two things. And if you have the people on the other side to pick up those crossing illegally, why do you need the wall? Of course, there are walls, there's parts of walls across the border, but the border is about 2,000 miles long, and the idea of having a physical type wall as the solution to this problem was totally unrealistic. And so the U.S. has had waves of migrants similar to what we're seeing on the southwest border, over the years. So that's in the 1959 Cuban Revolution produced many migrants coming to the United States. Matter of fact, since 1959, approximately 1 million Cubans have immigrated to the United States. And of course, many of them have descendants, so the Cuban-American community is quite large. After the Vietnam War, we had about 400,000 Vietnamese come to the United States and enter as refugees. In 1980, Fidel Castro said that any Cuban who wants to leave can do so, after there was a crisis at the Peruvian embassy where people were barricaded and demanding to leave. Well, 120,000 Cubans showed up in Florida in 30 days. And then, going further back in history, you had the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920, which created huge displacements of people, and hundreds of thousands of Mexicans made their way across the U.S. border. Most stayed. And then more recently, we had in the 1990s, in the Clinton administration, we had the Cuban and Haitian rafters, the boat people, who were coming to the U.S., and we responded to that by apprehending them at sea and detaining them at the Guantanamo Cuban Naval Base. So that eliminated that problem for the moment. But really what we see is this flow of migrants to the U.S. from Latin America, this ebb and flow, is something that's been going on for the last century. And, we have to sort of look at the reasons for that. In 1924, the U.S. introduced a major immigration legislation which severely restricted the flow of European immigrants, especially from the countries that were sending the largest number of immigrants in Southern and Eastern Europe. Now, when this law passed, it was controversial at this time. Immigration was a big issue, just as it is today. And this bill severely restricted immigration to the United States. One example, in 1921, 250,000 Italians immigrated to the United States at a time when the U.S. population was only 1/3 of what it is today. After the passage of this law, Italian immigration dropped to less than 10,000 a year. So this was really directed at Southern and Eastern Europe. What about Latin America? Well, Latin America, the whole Western Hemisphere, wasn't even included in this. There was absolutely no numerical restriction on immigrants from the Western Hemisphere. There were restrictions in that immigrants had to show they were self-supporting and had a job, but basically there was no restriction on Western Hemisphere. And we did have substantial immigration from Canada, from Mexico, and from the Caribbean. It was only in 1965 that the U.S. imposed numerical limits on Western Hemisphere immigration. And at the same time, we ended in the 1965, what was called the Bracero program, was a program that allowed Mexican agricultural and other workers to come to the United States for temporary periods and return to Mexico. But this, 1965, the height of the civil rights era in the United States, this program was perceived to be, and was in many cases, very poor conditions for the workers and a lot of abuse of workers, at least in some instances, and that people felt this is something we should no longer do. So we eliminated this temporary work program, which brought tens of thousands of workers to the United States. Although 1965 imposed numerical limits on Western Hemisphere immigration, it did not apply the system that was applicable to Europe, which required immigrants, for the most part, to either show job skills that were in short supply in the United States, or to be relatives of people who are already here. And those slides that I showed you, predominantly relatives plus some employment-based and refugees. By 1975, however, the U.S. incorporated the Western Hemisphere into the same system that scored immigrants according to whether or not they were related to someone here or had high job skills. And this decision in 1975, this legislation, essentially eliminated the possibility of low-skilled worker immigration to the United States, or legal immigration at any rate. Now, the demand for low-skilled labor continued in the U.S. economy. and that and at the same time that border enforcement was very weak. And so we developed a large number of undocumented workers in the United States. And by 1986, there was a consensus that we had to do something about this, and there was a major program to legalize these migrants who had arrived in the United States before 1982. And so we legalized through this program about 1.6 million workers. Many of these people were working in agriculture. Now, of course, when these people became legal residents, they had more opportunities. And many of them, if not most, moved off the farms and into the cities, and where they could get better jobs, steady jobs, they had better living conditions. And that left a gap in agriculture. And so those workers were filled by, guess what? Undocumented workers. And this led to, the farm communities in the United States demanding that they have access to workers, because most Americans or people in the legal working market were unwilling to do this type of work. So that led to the Immigration Act of 1990, which legalized agricultural workers. So about 1 million workers were legalized under that. Now, the 86 and the 90 Acts also increased the penalties for illegal migrants. But these penalties were not enforced. It also, the 86 Act introduced a requirement that for the first time, if you were an employer, it was against the law to knowingly employ an undocumented worker. Prior to that, despite all of the other laws, it was explicitly legal to hire an undocumented worker. Okay, why did this happen? Well, because we have this tension between the demand for workers and the feeling of others who wanted to end unregulated migration. But in this case, in the 1952 law, which put this provision in law, it was because of agricultural interest. And they did not want to give up the migrant workers that later were eliminated in the Bracero program. So by the mid-1990s, immigration enforcement had tightened up. This was beginning under the Clinton administration, and it was getting more difficult to cross the border. It was quite, this is the time I was the U.S. Consul in Juarez, Mexico, and illegally crossing the border was quite easy. You could do it in the middle of downtown El Paso and Juarez. The two cities face each other right across this river. And every day you would see people commuting to work across the border, across the river. There were little rafts or inner tubes. They would go across, they'd go to work, and at the end of the day, they'd come back, on the inner tubes the same way. And this is in plain sight. But it was only in the mid-90s when the Border Patrol had enough resources to ultimately begin to stop that daily flow. Now, what happened? If you're the guy who's working and all of a sudden it's really difficult to get across the border, what did they do? Well, they moved over to the U.S. permanently, because you could go a couple miles out of town and cross the border and stay over. But commuting back and forth became more difficult. So this led a lot of the Mexican workers, including the migrant workers, who would go for a season, to say it's too difficult, too dangerous, and too expensive to commute back and forth. I'm going to settle down in the United States. So we had more undocumented migrants settling in the United States. Now, ultimately, this led to calls to sort of benefit these people who had come over now to take these jobs permanently or live in the United States permanently. And President George W. Bush introduced legislation which would have created, again, another documentation or legalization program. But at the time, immigration was becoming more controversial in the United States, both because of impatience with just the weakness of the border controls, and some Americans concerned, well, we're just getting too many immigrants, and that became an issue as well. And that legislation foundered, and that's been the situation until the present day. Now, just looking at migration, we see what we call the push factors. That is, the circumstances in countries which make people want to leave. It could be wars, revolutions, discrimination, economic conditions, poverty. All of these are reasons why people might want to pick up and go. But there are also the pull factors, which are opportunities. And in the case of the United States, it was the economic opportunity of the U.S. job market, the ability to get to the United States, to settle, to have a better life for the migrant, and in many cases, they're thinking of their children. The U.S. economy continues to generate millions of low-skilled jobs, and there is no legal alternative for permanent migration of low-skilled workers to the United States. So you have this continuing demand for jobs and the inability to fill them with the existing labor market, and you have people abroad who want to leave anyway, and plus have opportunities to work in the United States. They're taking advantage of those opportunities, even though it implies a lot of risk on their part. So, according to U.S. Homeland Security, in the last fiscal year ended on September 30th, nearly 1 million undocumented migrants presented themselves at the southern border, mostly claiming political asylum. To me, the real story is, so what happened to these 1 million people? Are they on the street corners begging? Are they in homeless shelters? We don't see them in the U.S. They're working. We have the lowest unemployment rate in modern history in the United States. The kids are in school, the parents are working, and they also have large communities of migrants already in the U.S. from these countries who are, in many cases, they're close relatives. They're brothers or sisters, fathers or mothers. And so people have a place to go and people who can help them with accommodations to find them a job and then just adjusting to life in the United States. So this is this phenomenon called chain migration. You know, we were talking about the evils of chain migration. And what it means is that people who have friends and relatives, close friends and relatives in the U.S. who are willing to help them have a greater propensity to immigrate than people who have no cons, even if they have the same dire circumstances of their neighbors. It is the fact that they have people they can go to, not only to give them a place to stay, help them find a job, but to finance their trip, because these migrants have very few resources. But with a relative in the United States, that relative can provide the resources to help them make the difficult journey and pay the smugglers or whatever else they need to sustain themselves until they get to the United States. I think there's a question then of why are we having this situation occur right now? And I think there's a couple reasons for that, and they've been highlighted earlier. One is that there has been an effort in the United States to assist people, and a lot of legal work has been done to assist people. Although we had years and years of Mexican undocumented migration to the United States, up to the present, Mexicans have not applied for political asylum in the United States. There are 126 million Mexicans. We have virtually no applications for political asylum. It doesn't mean that politics and things are perfect in Mexico. It's just there hasn't been a tradition. And there's a new interpretation of political asylum advocated by attorneys and immigrant advocates that would expand the traditional categories to encompass things like criminal violence or poverty, which is not a base of legislation. This is going to work itself out through the courts. But in the meantime, the courts have been overwhelmed and unable to resolve all of these questions and adjudicate these cases. So when the incarceration strategy collapsed, they were left with, okay, let them in and let them go on. And the interesting thing, having gone down to the border and looked at this, both the organizations, the NGOs which support the migrants, and the border authorities of the United States said virtually all of the Central American migrants who are released, and at that point virtually all were being released, have a place to go in the United States. and people who are assisting them by paying their onward transportation and giving them a place to stay. So if the conditions pushing migrants out were universally applicable in these countries of Central America, why is it that those people who are ending up at the U.S. border have almost universally demonstrate they have ties to the United States, they have people in the United States who are going to take them in? So I think you see a real connection between these divided families, especially in the absence of any new legislation since 1990 that would allow families to reunite. And so giving up hope that they could reunite, the confusion in U.S. policy, the social media, the use of cell phones, which makes people in Central America aware immediately of changes in U.S. law and policy, which might benefit them or not benefit them. Now, finally, and then the final thing is demographic change in Mexico. Mexico's rate of population increase now is under 1%. The Mexican economy is booming. There are jobs in Mexico now. Matter of fact, some of the Central Americans are taking jobs in Mexico. And so the reliance on Mexico as an unlimited source of temporary workers to the United States or permanent workers is less the case today than it has been. And there are more economic opportunities in Mexico today for Mexican citizens. Not to say that there aren't disparities between the two countries, but it's clear that things are improving in Mexico. Economic opportunities are increasing. So we have a situation in the U.S. which I think has been dramatized by our politics. This phenomena of having migrants come to the United States responding to U.S. Job market changes and also conditions in home countries has been going on for a long time. And that the current strategy, which the U.S. is employing after trying everything else, is to process refugees on the border the way we process refugees everywhere else in the world, that they temporarily remain in a third country where their cases can be, traditionally, you have non-governmental organizations which sort of sort through them. They're ultimately referred to U.S. immigration officers for evaluation and then are able to migrate to the United States. In this case, it looks like the plan is to allow them to come back to the border and process them. I'm not sure that's going to work. But in some sense, that's not the real issue. I mean, to speak frankly, in terms of the administration, it's the politics of it, it's the emotion of it. And so I just like to close with one example. I talked about European and Latin American immigration. Of course, the first people excluded from the United States were Asians. Initially the Chinese, but then all Asians were completely excluded until 1952. And that the arguments at the time were, Asians are, they cannot possibly assimilate to the United States. They are just too different. They're an inferior race. Today, in the United States, Asian Americans are 6% of the U.S. population, 24% of the incoming class at Harvard University. So much for the inferior race arguments. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks. So I'm just going to sort of take this up where John left off. I want to thank Melissa for organizing. Where is Melissa? There you are. I hope you'll wave at me when I'm running over time. For organizing the panel. Thanks to Victor for including us in this great event and the other sponsors. So I'm sort of referring back to some themes that were mentioned earlier. The question, is it a crisis? I would say there is not a crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border, but there is a crisis, and the crisis is in Central America. And why is there a crisis? Many reasons, multi-causal situation, but partly to a large extent because of policies enacted by the U.S. government in that region. And so to understand the roots of the push factors leading to migration to the United States at the current moment by Central Americans, we have to look at the history. So But before I start, I just want to mention this is sort of background to a bigger research project I'm involved in that's funded by SSHRC, involving a team of researchers looking at transnational activism in North America, looking at transnational activism around migrant rights, labor rights, and human rights in Mexico. I'm working with Christina Gabriel of Carleton, Jeffrey Ayers of St. Michael's College, Vermont, Hepzibah Munoz Martinez from University of New Brunswick, Kathleen Stout at University of Texas El Paso, and Eduardo Mendoza Cota from Colegio de la Frontera Norte and UCSD. So this is just kind of setting the stage for this other work that we're embarking on, which does involve interviews at the border, but so far I haven't managed to get to the border. Well, I have been to San Diego, but not to the Mexican side yet. We hear a lot of talk about coming from Trump and his supporters about how the asylum claimant system is being rampantly abused, and that's the problem. That's the problem, is that the asylum claimant system is not working properly. We're letting in, as was earlier referred to, sort of shithole people from shithole countries, and that's the problem. And this discourse, in fact, is not absent, not that bad language. I'm sorry, I never use this language in public, but the situation sort of calls for it. This type of language is also being replicated in Canadian politics today. Interestingly, leading up to the election, Andrew Scheer felt the need to go to Roxham Road, where asylum claimants are trickling into Canada, claiming that there is a crisis also at our border. So that's something we might want to think about. So I also want to emphasize that the crisis that we're talking about is regional in nature. It is not limited to one country, or it's not limited to domestic factors within any given country. It's a regional dynamic and therefore has to be addressed regionally. So to give you a sense of this, where the migrants coming from, primarily from the so-called Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, particularly Honduras. And they're traveling up through Mexico in these kind of limited routes, and ultimately making their way to the border. And we saw the migrant caravans doing that type of travel from Honduras to Tijuana and other border sites across the U.S.-Mexico border. So what are the roots of this situation? Here's some data from the UNHCR about the magnitude of the problem, the number of internally displaced people in these three countries, and how they're attempting to move forward. So the roots of this problem, I would say, to some extent, lie with this guy, Ronald Reagan, but date before that. Of course, we have to think back to centuries of repression, racism, land theft, Indigenous peoples' land being stolen, first by the Spanish and by national elites in these countries. But on top of that, regular U.S. intervention in the forms of economic, political, and military intervention, and very importantly, blocked democratic reforms. So there was an upsurge of democratic demands that were not met within the system, and the U.S. actively blocked democratic reformers from coming to power, which led to the shift to eventually in the 1980s to revolutionary wars that took place in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala, which I won't talk about, but this is how I started working on this region. I did my PhD work in Central America in the 80s, and also worked as an activist trying to promote the peace process. So we did get a peace process in the 1990s, thank goodness. And a lot of us had hopes that this would lead to resolution of the domestic problems. There was language about addressing problems around access to land and resources. But in fact, the problems did not go away. They just shifted in character. Violence remained pretty much just as high as during the Revolutionary War period. but it took the form of homicides, drug-related issues, gangs. And basically the problem was you had a large number of young men with access to weapons and a history of violence and trauma who were left unemployed by the peace process. On top of that, you had decades of neoliberal policies that did not address the economic causes of the dispute, but rather aggravated them, and empowered the role of domestic oligarchs supported by American partners who have taken on a sort of toxic role in the politics of the region. In the 2000s, another factor comes to play. Of course, Central America is a region that knows about natural disasters. They're not all the result of climate change, but a large part of the reasons for people's movements now have to do in part with the effects of climate change that have led to floods and droughts. And this was the immediate precursor of some of the movement of people, especially from Honduras, I think. On top of that, you had a coup in Honduras. Sorry, I got the wrong date on there. It was 2009. In which, again, a sort of democratic reformer was pushed out of power in a coup that was supported by the U.S. government and essentially by the Canadian government as well. And this contributed to the entrenchment of violence. And also, at the same time, we have these criminal organizations that are actually born in the United States, in the prisons, in Los Angeles, and exported back to Central America. And these are young Central American men who are recruited into gangs. They're sort of following the model of gang violence that had been established in Los Angeles, and then they're deported to their countries of origin under sort of tough on crime models and go back to their home countries. And again, unemployed, no economic prospects, and so they look for whatever means they can use to make a living, and that happens to be crime and violence. So this is a chart that I've borrowed heavily from Dr. Rafael Alonso Hernandez Lopez from COLEF. That just sort of, I'm not going to go into the details, but especially the ideas of the natural disasters playing a role, the high levels of poverty, particularly in Honduras, which again is the source of many of the current migrants, the lack of education, and in particular, the level of violence. So I don't know if people appreciate how high the level of violence in these countries is. Much higher than Mexico, the rate of homicides. These are a bit old figures, and it's hard to get up-to-date figures, but Honduras, again, being the most egregious case of 56.52 homicides per 100,000 of the population, which is either the highest in the world or second highest in the world. So there's something about this model, this political, economic, and regional model that has been established that propagates violence and then leads to people fleeing that violent situation. Interestingly, Nicaragua, which is on the same isthmus, drugs are flowing through Nicaragua too, the rate of violence is much, much lower. Again, these are a bit old, and I'm sure it's gone up since then, but 7 per 100,000 compared to 56 per 100,000. So, to do a more complete analysis, we'd want to look at the political economic model in each of these countries and how it may encourage or discourage violence. We should keep in mind Venezuela also has an extremely high rate of violence, and we are also seeing a migrant crisis of enormous proportions occurring there. And then I just wanted to mention recent events in Honduras. This is not really in our news the way, the migrant caravans, as we were discussing earlier, exploded across the front pages of newspapers and covered in the media. There's also and it's also not being covered the way the violence or the protests in Hong Kong are being covered, or the protests in Venezuela for that matter. But there's also an enormous political crisis occurring in Honduras that has been taking place since the coup, which itself involved high rates of violence. environmental defenders. 128 environmental defenders have been murdered since 2010. The country has one of the highest rates of femicide in the world. Only 2 to 5% of cases are ever successfully brought to justice. And the police system, the justice system is completely implicated in this situation of violence and of drug trafficking. And so this has particularly come to light in recent days as the brother of the current president of Honduras is on trial in New York. And it has been revealed in that trial, or has been alleged in that trial, that $1.5 million, I might be getting that wrong, was paid by El Chapo to the brother to go to the president of Honduras. So it's become very, very clear that Honduras is now a narco state run by people who are themselves carrying out the drug trade, carrying out the violence. And it's not surprising in that very toxic political environment that people are trying to exit the country. Okay, I'll go on. Oops, sorry, that was duplicates. Slide. So these are just a couple of pictures I took at a migrant shelter in Mexico City. This is a temporary hostel for migrants. It's not any kind of permanent solution. Not that there are permanent solutions really in Mexico. Mexico does, yes, the migrants are being sent back to Mexico. Mexico is historically a sending state for migration. It's not historically a transit state, and it does not have the infrastructure, the wherewithal, the resources to deal with the huge influx of migrants that are now arriving in that country. So I went to this shelter that's one of the Father Solalinde's shelters in the north of Mexico City. Terrible situation, tiny, cram with people. There was this lovely Venezuelan guy working there with absolutely no training or education. I don't think he'd even been to high school. Lovely, lovely guy trying to cope. He's telling me about gunshots happening outside the door. Because it's in a violent area, so you're not exactly in a place of safety when you're in this so-called hostel or shelter. And indeed, the infrastructure is basically NGOs. NGOs are the ones that are supposed to step up to the plate in the absence of any real state-funded or state-organized system of hostels. And the UNHCR itself has very, very limited infrastructure in Mexico or Central America for that matter. So it's a really difficult situation for Mexico. So in this context, we see interesting politics occurring in Mexico. Of course, somewhat tragically, we see elected in Mexico for the first time ever leftist president elected at the height of this crisis, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. He comes to office saying we're going to take a different approach to migration. We're not going to be tough on the migrants. We're going to recognize that there are root causes like the ones I was just talking about. We're going to address the root causes. We're not going to use violence. We're going to treat people with love and understanding. But into that equation, we have to add Trump and what I'm calling, I don't even know if extortionary is a real word. Is that a word? I always ask my students, is that a word? Extortionist policies. And I think it's interesting the way he's operating, to me, is very similar to the way the cartels operate, that he's saying, we're going to put these tariffs on, and if you don't meet our demands, we're going to raise the tariffs, and we're going to keep raising them. And this is exactly the way cartel members operate. They go to your door, they demand a payment. If you don't pay up, they raise the payment, and they threaten to do bad things to you. It's exactly the same logic and form of behavior. And in this context, the discourse and the actual policies of the Mexican government have now shifted dramatically to much more back to the bad old days of sort of mano dura, hard iron fist policies towards towards migrants, treating them as criminals, detaining them, expelling them from the country. Sorry, I meant to say at the beginning when he was elected, Lopez Obrador did hand out humanitarian visas to the migrants, and he did work to try to find jobs in the maquila factories near the border, and that seemed like good but not sufficient. But now the emphasis is much more on a more repressive approach. And also somewhat tragically, Mexico has its own problems of violence, and he had promised that his response to the violence would be the creation of a National Guard, which, many people, many human rights organizations have a lot of trouble with. It is a more militaristic response to the crisis. We could discuss that. But interestingly, the National Guard is not being used now to address the problems of violence and crime in Mexico. It's being used to patrol the southern border and so forth. At the same time, though, he is still pushing the idea of a Central American development plan, which would create new infrastructure in the Central American countries and perhaps create jobs for migrants and solve some of the problems. I should say also, part of this broader extortionary politics that we see going on, extortionist politics, is the imposition or the pushing of so-called safe third country policies throughout the region, creating a kind of chokehold through positions throughout the region. So Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala have all been coerced, I would say, into accepting the idea that they will be so-called safe third countries. They're not using that terminology, but they're saying that asylum claimants will have to go there to the countries creating the violence to make their asylum claim because they are so-called safe countries, and the people will not be able to proceed northward towards the United States. They have to make the claim in Honduras if they're coming from El Salvador. And they've also tried to coerce Panama and Costa Rica into accepting similar policies to push the chokehold further south to where it's a narrower piece of land, but so far they have not succeeded in coercing those two countries. So in this context, I just to close by thinking, what is Canada's role in this? As I alluded to earlier, we have our own safe third country policy, which has been the subject of considerable debate in this last election and before, which was signed in 2002 between the U.S. and Canada, but not in this case because the U.S. forced Canada to do so, but because Canada asked for such policies to limit the number of refugee claimants making their way to Canada, so that in the past, we'd accepted generously many Central American migrants during the wars in the 80s who had traveled through the U.S. Now people like that can't travel through the U.S. and make a claim in Canada. They have to make their claim in the U.S. So that's part of the situation. But I also think we should think about, AMLO's proposals for a Central American development plan and for addressing the issues of refugees systematically in their countries of origin or wherever they make their way. Mexico has been asking Canada to contribute to that plan, as has the UNHCR. And so far, with little or no luck, Canada does provide aid to Central American countries, but one might ask what's going to happen if Andrew Scheer is elected with his promise of cutting our foreign aid budget by 25%. It is to cry. So I will stop there, and thank you very much.
I mean, this is a question for John very quickly. Therefore, I mean, we haven't measured this, but the push factors that Laura was talking about are just the focus of the media. This is what the media right now, this is about Trump or versus Trump, that's it. But what you're saying, which is something very important, might be that the pull factors are having more an effect on the current on the current dynamics of irregular migration to the United States. Therefore, and also considering this economic pool, that it might be the fact that many of those, or the very big majority of those, considering today's definition of asylum or how to seek asylum, most of the people are not. Even though this is playing out in the courts, as you mentioned. I'm just trying to clarify this. Most of them are not, never will ever get asylum. Probably more than 90% of those, right?
Most won't get asylum, and if we look at history as a judge, most will not return to Central America.
Exactly.
Because, at each of these mass immigration waves, people establish their lives in the United States. They have children born in the United States, and for the vast majority of them don't leave the United States. They somehow, over a long period of time, manage to find a way to stay legally.
But what about the lawyers that are providing services on the other side of the border, giving know your rights, and understanding how this works? It's unethical to do that, right? Understanding how the law works, understanding. They understand what is the definition. So I
don't know if it's unethical. The attorneys are pressing the courts to essentially broaden the criteria for asylum, to include things that are not explicit in the law, such as economic hardship, such as civil violence, natural disasters, whatever. And that will have to be tested over time, and I don't know how it's going to turn out. But I think ultimately it's very difficult for the U.S. to expel mass numbers of people. We haven't really done this in the past. Perhaps we're at a historical turning point, but I suspect, based on our previous history, that these people will eventually be able to stay. They may have to go through a lot of hardship in the U.S., particularly under the current policies, but you're not seeing hundreds of thousands of people rounded up in the United States and bused to the border. That isn't happening yet. We are a country with, 12 million people who are undocumented that we calculate now. With these Central Americans, we're adding, although technically I guess they're documented because they've been released, but they don't have status. We had temporary protected status for years for Central Americans, the people who were the war refugees, the hurricane refugees, the earthquake refugees from various countries, and so we didn't have the heart to expel them. On the other hand, we didn't want to give them legal status. What do we give? Temporary protected status. Well, you can stay here and work, but you can't become a citizen. You can't get permanent status. And that seems to be what's happening today as well.
I'm just one last thing. I'm sorry. Just one last thing. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No. Just one last thing about the Mexican economy booming. I have a very different understanding of that. But even considering the data of economic growth in the past 25 years, since 1994, let's say, Mexico has has been stagnant, Mexican economy. So I would like I'm finishing, and I'm sorry, I wanted to listen to Laura's point, but I just want to know what are you referring to, that Mexican economy is booming and that it gives a lot of opportunities?
Say, perhaps it's like the U.S. economy, that we have low unemployment, and yet people over the last 20 years have not seen their economic situation dramatically improve. And I think some of that is Mexico. There are jobs in Mexico, particularly in northern Mexico, in the maquila industries. That's creating gaps in the agricultural economy as people move to the factories. And so people from countries that are even worse condition, from Central America, you find Central Americans working in Mexico, documented or undocumented, the way we found Mexicans working in the U.S. in low status or low income jobs. So I think you're right. I take your point, may have exaggerated the impact on the Mexican economy, but it is providing more jobs for people, both Mexicans and others, than it has historically, in my view.
Laura, did you want to respond to
Oh, there's so many questions there. Yes, I agree that the economy is not doing well. And that's one of the factors that's putting pressure on López Obrador to cave to U.S. demands, even though it might not have been such a wise move to cave, because if Trump had kept increasing the tariffs, I don't know if Melissa has a view on this, there was strong opposition to Trump's policies coming from U.S.-based businesses. And, putting on those tariffs on Mexican exports is essentially taxing our own products because of the integrated value chains that occur across the border. So it was not a sensible economic policy by any means, but it put a huge amount of pressure on López Obrador, and he chose to cave in response to that. I had something else I was going to say, but I've forgotten.
Was there another question?
So maybe just to follow up on the sort of the patterning, because I'm certainly familiar from the 80s of sort of Central American, the unfortunate effects of American imperialism in the area for those countries. To what extent do the other countries around it, I guess I'm trying to figure out a little bit to what extent we can tease out the effects of a kind of militarized or demilitarized but violent society versus a poor society. So I don't know if Belize, Costa Rica, and other countries around there are sort of in a similar economic position and therefore a good comparator, and we can say, oh, it's not the economy, it's the sort of history, or whether it's people would say, well, those are wealthier countries, or they're just humming along their little Switzerlands down there, and they don't produce anybody. So I just wondered it, because we don't hear a lot about Belize, for example. I don't know much about it. I just don't know how much the destitution versus kind of imperialism.
I don't know about Belize, I must admit. Nicaragua is an extremely poor country. So it is not just poverty that creates violence. There's a big literature on what creates violence and what doesn't, and poverty is not up there. If you look at Africa, the rates of homicide are much lower, even though those are much poorer countries. And it's not just drugs, because drugs are traveling through those countries as well. So I think it has to do more with, it's very complicated. Maybe I think the Nicaraguan government, which is the best comparator, has been more effective at controlling their police and military forces. And so we haven't seen the same kind of dynamic where the military and the police become entrenched in the drug trade themselves. Not that it doesn't happen. And we, and there haven't been the same struggles between rival drug cartels, which is largely an explanation for why violence broke out in Mexico and in Central America, or the Northern Triangle countries. And maybe there's better kind of rule of law in Nicaragua, even though it is not a democratic place right now. Still, there's a better capacity of the state to control the population and also be delivering some benefits to the population as well. So it's not a neoliberal government, and there have been social policies in place that kind of reduce the violence. What I was going to say is that these policies of returning everybody to the place they started out are just, to me, a recipe for disaster, that we're sending people back into kind of a pressure cooker atmosphere, and it's already in Honduras. We're seeing high levels of protest against the situation of the current government, and it's going to explode in violence. And the key to the U.S.-Mexico relationship for many years was stability. That the U.S. wanted Mexico to be stable at any cost. They kind of lost that situation, and we're going to just keep on making that situation worse unless. Really, I think AMLO is right. We need to find a way to address the problems in Central America, and particularly those three countries. And it's not just money. It's also rule of law, getting rid of impunity, supporting justice systems that work, and so forth. Civil society.
Well, I think we need a much more interventionist policy in Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, in ways that we're not intervening now. and I mean, the other countries, Panama, of course, is not. not sending migrants, is doing relatively well. Costa Rica traditionally has done very well. There are, these countries have different internal circumstances. They can be aggravated by what the U.S. or other countries do, or they could be improved by what the U.S. and other countries do. They are aggravated by the totally external factors like narco-trafficking, deportation of gang members had a terrible impact. The leftover guns from the civil wars in Central America and Guatemala. And so, yes, I think that intervention in the right way, through development, through, stronger rule of law programs, and, to be frank, being the heavy sometimes with governments for the right reasons makes more sense to me. And if corruption is a major issue, if rule of law, if undisciplined police who are people who join police to perform criminal acts, this is complicated. But again, these are not huge countries. These are tiny countries. The ability of the U.S. and other countries to have an impact is greater than they would be on a Ukraine or, major countries of Africa. We can actually do something. We have a lot of influence here, but we have to be very thoughtful of the way we do it and have a long-term plan. It's not something you can do like that.
In response to your last comment, the U.S. can do things for these countries. But the U.S. is damned whether it does or whether it doesn't. I mean, we all know that. The U.S. was instrumental in bringing prosperity to a huge sector of the population of this world in the Far East. In China, for instance, would not have been able to do it without the technology transfer from the United States of America. With regard to the wall, as an engineer, I think perhaps it's more costly to build a wall than to dig a ditch 30 feet deep, 60 feet high to stop the traffic. I mean, look, if Mexico can build gated communities, who are they protecting themselves from? Americans or fellow Mexicans who are not so savory subjects? So why shouldn't the United States be entitled to build a border? We build fences around farms. We do all kinds of things. Why shouldn't the United States be able to do it?
I don't think there's any legal reason that would prevent us from doing an international legal reason. It's just a question of what's cost effective, I would say. And at one point, in the U.S., there was this potential deal that the Congress was going to fund the wall if President Trump agreed to legalize the children of the illegal migrants, the DACA people. And so a group of, basically the Democrats got on board with that, and they were going to do the deal. And in the end, Trump walked away from it and said, no, I also want to dramatically reduce legal immigration, and the deal collapsed. But I don't look at the wall in moral terms. I know some people do. I look at it in simply effective. The cost of building a 2,000-mile Maginot Line between the U.S. and Mexico is going to have the same success that the Maginot Line had against the Nazis. They went around it, or they're under it, or they'll go by sea, or they'll come through Canada. But this is a phenomenon. Physical barriers don't work. We do have, in the U.S., one very effective tool to stop illegal migration, and it's called E-Verify, because we can determine whether or not somebody applying for a job is legally authorized to work. We don't use that system. Why don't we use this system? Well, because employers who are desperate for employees don't want to use it, and they lobby very effectively not to have universal use of this system. And so it gets to the U.S. problem. We have very strict rules, very weak enforcement, because there are political groups which benefit from weak enforcement, and those are, of course, the employers and advocates for immigrants who want weak enforcement. And yet those people who are restrictionists are very effective in getting Congress to enact laws which penalize illegal migrants, make them felons. But in the end, look what happens. We still have this flow of workers to the United States. They're integrated into our economy. And so far, we have not had a mass expulsion of migrants to the U.S. in our entire history. And so I doubt, based on that historical record, we're going to see 12 million people deported from the United States.
No, it's okay.
Hello, thanks for those, really interesting. I was just, I feel like we're doing the thing where we identify the problem as coming from down there still, like that's been the shape of the conversation for like good reasons also, but I'm wondering if we could get back to, and you just did start to actually, this question of like what, internal to the US, what could be done to address this issue, like you've got this demand for, obviously the issue of refugee and asylum, it kind of complicates it, but in terms of the economic aspect of the migration, right? What could be done? How does the US need to like clean up its own house, or like what would be productive? And you're talking about this issue of like weak enforcement, but maybe could we think more broadly about what possible resolutions to these economic problems within the US that are causing that would be interesting.
In terms of employment, a temporary job program with protections for work that is temporary, such as agricultural harvesting work, and a permanent legal visas for people who are taking permanent jobs, like maybe working on a dairy farm, which is year-round, is not seasonal, and yet there's a desperate need for workers in dairy farms and certain other areas of the economy. Care of the elderly in the United States, or hospital workers, support workers, there's a great demand for those. But these are not workers that can qualify under our current immigration system. So that's one way to adjust it. And then having methods that make it much easier for these temporary workers to go back and forth, to transfer money back to their villages and in their home countries, and much stronger policies in terms of moving these small Central American countries into policy situations that protect their citizens and create opportunities in their own countries. So there are many different things you have to do at the same time. This requires a lot of energy, political energy on the part of the United States. And in our current situation, we are using our energy on a lot of domestic issues and divisions. And, throughout the world, we're not focusing on the foreign policy aspects of what we need to be doing every day to assure, a more secure and better future for our own citizens. So it's complicated, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, there was almost a deal. When was that? McCain was leading, trying to do a deal with the Democrats. When was that, like 12 years ago?
Of course there was. George Bush,
Bush,
introduced an immigration bill that would have documented all these workers in the United States. Mm-hmm. And then the Democrats succeeded in getting a majority in the House. And it looked like, this was 2009, mm-hmm. looked like it was all going to come together, but then it fell apart. The divisiveness of this issue scared away a lot of politicians who might otherwise have supported it.
I guess maybe building on the last question or comment, I'm curious about where the spaces are for discussion around when we talk about generators, but in relation to, say, foreign policy of governments like the United States or even Canada, where there's interests in other countries that generate displacement or migration. Are those conversations happening, and are there policies that, do they need to happen more? Where would they happen in a better, a more effective way that would actually address some of the determinants of displacement and migration that end up in, forced migrations that are maybe a little bit off the radar in the public imaginary? So that's one question. The other one is around the Central American migration. Is your project also, Laura, talking about when they go when migrants move south as well, and how that compares? Like, there's large numbers in, I don't know, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, other places, or is it just mostly talking about the move north? Yeah, okay, that's an easy question, but I'll leave the other one open.
The Venezuelans are moving south more than they are north. About 250,000 Venezuelans in the U.S., 2 million in Colombia, and hundreds of thousands in Ecuador, Peru, and Chile, Brazil. And it's been a mass exodus of Venezuelans. It isn't as much a story in the U.S. because they're not coming here, but it is on the scale or double the scale of what we've seen the Central Americans doing to the U.S.
Because it's a much bigger country.
Yeah, there are many more people involved. And the irony is this was one of the wealthiest countries in the region. This was the country that every other Latin American country aspired to be, not that long ago. And it's really tragic what has happened.
Sheila, I didn't quite catch your first question.
Well, yeah, and actually that's maybe a good point to start with, like in terms of maybe the role of U.S. policy, even in relation to why Venezuelans are kind of moving everywhere. They're not going to the States, but they're going elsewhere. It's a broader conversation around the determinants of displacement and migration that have to do with things like, foreign policy, economic interests, things like that are a little bit harder to get at. And I think there's a lot to be said there and a lot to be discussed. It's just where are the spaces and what kind of policy needs to be a little bit more advancing to get at these determinants, I guess, is the broad question.
Well, good luck with that, because we couldn't have a foreign policy debate in the Canadian elections. Nobody would agree to it. There's been virtually no discussion of foreign policy. The only real contribution to discussion of development policy has been the Conservative Party proposal to cut foreign aid by 25% based on completely erroneous claims about where our aid money is going. Like, there's just been no enlightened discussion of that. And I would add, activists in Canada and in Central America are also looking at the role of Canadian mining companies that are encroaching onto the lands of Indigenous peoples in Honduras and elsewhere, and who are seen as a deep part of the problem as well. And so a lot of the environmental activists that are being murdered or prosecuted or imprisoned are also involved in struggles against Canadian mining companies. So that's a discussion.
But the early part of your country, what could Canada and the U.S. and Mexico? I think there is a huge potential for Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. To work together on the Central American migration issues, because I think there's essentially a commonality of interest here, and that it needs the political energy and the leadership, leadership, to focus on this as an issue. And yes, I think our three countries could do a tremendous amount to alleviate this crisis, definitely. So let's hope
under another
next couple
government,
years.
Perhaps.
All right.
Good.
Thank you all. Thanks for your questions.
Thanks a lot.